there's a tradition that some of the other presenters have had where they've introduced themselves. I'll briefly say my name is Russell Weisman. I go by Rusty because my father's name was Russell Weisman. His father's name was Russell Weisman. And they were prominent people. So today I'm going to talk about some things that intersect in a way that's coincidental, but I think meaningful. We're going to talk about climate change, sudden climate change, and how it affected parts of the world that we're in now, but all the rest of the world as well. We're going to talk about some astronomical events that happened here in this part of the world, a couple of total eclipses in close succession. We're going to talk about some oral tradition that may relate to those events. I'm going to start here in 9,000 miles away in Indonesia, where in the year 1257, the largest volcanic eruption of the modern era occurred. This was enormous, almost beyond contemplation. The Citation volcano exploded 43 cubic kilometers of material into the stratosphere in about 10 hours. So imagine 43 cubic kilometers of Diet Coke. And then take a couple of, rose bowls full of Mentos. You've all seen that thing where the Diet Coke and the Mentos go to the sky? That's what this was like. It was crazy. And it changed the world's climate. And it changed things here. The way it did this, in part, was by spewing a bunch of sulfuric and hydrochloric acid particles into the stratosphere, which then scattered light. They have long-term residence in the stratosphere. There's not a lot of weather there. They scatter light for quite a while and cool things off quickly. We'll talk about some archaeological evidence for that and some historic evidence as well. We have relatively modern examples of similar kinds of events that are of smaller scale. So this is Mount Pinatubo in 1991. Citation was orders of magnitude bigger than this, and this is pretty impressive. The things that people here, far away, 9,000 miles away, would have seen as a result of these volcanic eruptions were incredibly vivid sunsets for several years, like that one after Mount Pinatubo. And this thing called Bishop's Ring, the sort of scattering of light around the sun by ice crystals in the stratosphere. This was first noted after the Krakatoa eruption by the bishop in Hawaii, and named after him. The eclipses I want to talk about occur in close succession in 1257, in June, on the 13th. Now, this is a Julian calendar, so that's at about the solstice. It's a day before the summer solstice. People are watching the sun at this time. And it occurs about midday, a little after noon. Sun is high in the sky. People were watching when this occurred. And the people at Mesa Verde would have seen this for about 3 minutes of totality. For those who, how many people saw the eclipse in 2017? Lots of us. So that was my first time. It's pretty impressive. And then a year and a half later, in 1259, we get another total eclipse in the same place, or partly in the same place, up on Mesa Verde in the northern San Juan. Again, about 3 minutes. That one's central to Chimney Rock, for example. So eclipses are rare things. It's hard to make average times between these total eclipses in the same place. The estimates are around the range of 370 years apart, but that's really not meaningful because they're so rare. You can have eclipses in a year apart, and you can have them be 800 years apart. Eclipse geometry is pretty straightforward. We get eclipses when the moon intervenes between an observer on Earth and the sun. They vary. We get lots of partial eclipses, but not very many total or annular eclipses. And they vary a lot because the apparent size of the moon changes so much. And I think that's a key feature. So there's an illustration of when the moon is far away from us and aligned perfectly. We get annular eclipses. This is running on time now, so I got a problem. I'm not going to be able to keep up. Help me. The cool stuff that you can see during a total eclipse, many of you probably saw in 2017. And these are all phenomenally important things. I didn't see any shadow bands, but I was really hopeful. I didn't get any shadow bands where I was, but I was able to see some planets. I did see very faint corona in 2017. The corona is a fabulous thing. And this is an aspect of the sun that you only can see during a total eclipse. And that Western science kind of misses the corona, which is sort of fascinating for those people who are saying, Western science catches up. The corona wasn't visible during the start of early Western science because there weren't very many sunspots. So I make a joke out of this, but it's not really funny. we've heard this week, and we hear often about how important it is that people act and behave in ways to maintain order and balance in the universe. And that when you perhaps are negligent of those duties, strange things can happen. So you have to wonder whether people on Mesa Verde, when they get these two eclipses, are wondering whether someone has neglected their religious duties or their actions. There are, across the world, lots and lots of beliefs about what happens during a solar eclipse. They're interesting. I can't say for sure what people on Mesa Verde believed prehistorically about what happened during an eclipse. But I want to focus on this first one. I don't want to talk about like sex between the sun and the moon and turn out the lights. It's kind of interesting, but I don't want to talk about it. I'm shocked. This idea that the sun dies and is being reborn has some ethnographic interest. Because there are three eclipses in the 19th century during which there are religious revitalization movements associated with total eclipses. The one that we know the most about is this one that involves the second ghost dance in 1890. The first ghost dance in 1870 followed a total eclipse in 1869, during which the prophet of the ghost dance had an out-of-body experience in a trance, went up to the world in the sky above the clouds, and met with God, came back to Earth, was given instructions about what had to be done to restore the Earth. People had to do a round dance. It's exactly what happened in 1890. And it turns out that the prophet of the 1890 ghost dance, his father was a disciple of the prophet of the 1870 ghost dance. Go back to Tecumseh's brother, the great prophet, the Shawnee prophet. He not only predicts this eclipse in 1806, and this is what got me started in this, we don't know how he did that, but people believe he caused it to happen. They flock to Tecumseh and his brother because they think he can open this door to the heavens. So this is Jack Wilson Wovoka, the prophet of the ghost dance of 1890. He lived in the Mason Valley in Nevada. He's a woodcutter. He's out when this eclipse starts, and like you can under a tree, when eclipses start, you can see the little crescents on the ground. He has an out-of-body experience during this eclipse in which he travels to the above world, meets with God, is instructed on things that need to be done to restore the earth and bring back his ancestors. Comes back out of this trance, he starts this ghost dance movement in which people are supposed to do a round dance that was going to restore the world. He lives a long time after that. He doesn't get what he's looking for, but he saw these things to start and know that this trance was the right thing to do, the way to get information. So eclipses are going to be meaningful religious events, I think, to people prehistorically as well. When Wilson does this, he's not inventing this idea. He's acting in practice. We know historically that Indians out on the plains recorded eclipses when they happened because they're in these winter counts that they did, annual pictographs marking memorable events in particular years. So that's the pictograph for 1869. It's an eclipse. And that's the path of the eclipse, and it's the spot where the winter count was collected. And here's what the daytime sky looked like during the eclipse. We've got Mars and Venus off up and above to the left of the eclipse zone, and that's the way the lone dog, the keeper of the winter count, recorded that eclipse. So he's done it in spatial order, which I think is fascinating. We see this in rock art as well now. So there's his winter count. At Chaco Canyon, we have this eclipse petroglyph. It's doing the same thing. It's recording the daytime sky at the time of that event, so that there's dots above and to the left and below and to the right of that eclipsed sun that are depicting Venus and Mars. So here's what the eclipses look like in daytime up on Mesa Verde. I don't know that there's rock art that looks like these. I've not seen rock art, but I wanted to show the sky at those times. There are lots of planets and stars visible during totality of those events. I'm going to go jump way off to Florida for beliefs about what happens when things that are alive die. And this is important because if the sun is dying during an eclipse, we've got to understand what people's beliefs would be about what that means. And so in the Calusa, who live in South Florida, they're the people that DeSoto met when he first landed. When priests show up to try to help them save their souls, they're perplexed because these people believe they have not one soul, but three. One that stays with the body, and two that leave the body. One of the ones that leaves the body is its shadow. And so, in an eclipse, what happens? The shadow touches the earth. And so if the sun is dying, and a shadow is touching the earth, is that not the soul of the sun? And doesn't that make for prominence? Okay, so the part of the soul that stays behind is the pupil of the eye, which is exactly what an eclipse looks like. That's a 19th century drawing of an eclipse in the human eye for comparison. So there have been lots of eclipses in the Southwest. Lots of them during late prehistory and early history. So these two, I think, are important because they co-occur with this time of climate change that occurs as a result of this Samolus volcano eruption simultaneously. The people that are living where these two eclipses overlap experience those events in close succession, and afterwards, what happened? It got cold first, in such a way that it was probably not possible to dry land farm anymore because it probably froze in every month. And then they got dry. And we'll see that all around the world. So there's a close-up of the region and the overlap of those two events. These really big volcanic eruptions spew all this stuff into the upper atmosphere in a way that creates sudden climate change. There's not a lot of weather in the stratosphere, so that all that vapor, the aerosol parts of these eruptions stays for a while, reflects back sunlight, cooling the earth. We can measure this in moderate eruptions. So in Mount Pinatubo, against a trend of increasing warming, we get a period of about a half a degree of cooling for a short time after Mount Pinatubo. And we get all those cool sunrises and sunsets. Records of past eruptions occur in ice cores in Greenland and in Antarctica. Studies of 54 of these show that this Samolus eruption in 1257 was the biggest eruption of the Common Era. Substantially bigger than anything else. Really massive. And it was bracketed by a couple of smaller eruptions on either side that were adding to its effects. There's a bunch of really good literature now in prestigious journals, in Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is not stuff published on like an envelope. There is a problem, however, for Southwestern archaeologists in particular. These events that should be affecting tree ring growth don't seem to show any period of no growth or slow growth. Trees seem to be growing fine as a result of, during this period when the Samolus eruption should be affecting local climate. And so Michael Mann, the climatologist, has had arguments with the dendrochronologists about this. Michael Mann says, well, the problem is we're missing tree rings. There are years when trees did not grow at all. And the dendrochronologists just freaked. They have completely, they've gone wild on Mann. And that's okay. They'll eventually solve this. So it was only in 2012 that we discovered where this volcano was. It was a mystery before that. We don't know. There's a miniature Pompeii there. There's an entire buried kingdom that was wiped out by it. We have proxy data for a similar eruption, in a similar place, in a similar time, but more recent in time. We also have great climatological data from this Tambora eruption of 1815. They're not very far apart. And in 1816, after the Tambora eruption, we got all across eastern North America where we have great data. A year without summer, a year in which there was a frost in every month, when really well-recorded events show that in every month of the year, if you were farming, you got wiped out. Your crops failed. And within the next 4 years, the economy of the United States collapses. Banks fail in 1820. Farmers leave Vermont and they move west to places like Ohio, where I'm from, in the Western Reserve. So in 1257, we don't have a lot of written documentation. We have some. This is Matthew of Paris, a Benedictine monk who lived in London. And between 1257 and 1259, he records events relating to the weather. And the weather was stinking awful there. Peasants were unable to earn a living. They flocked to London, and he died there in droves. I have a slide here that has pictures of human remains in it. And if this is difficult for you to see, I will warn you that I'm going to show this, and I show it for effect. I want people to know that Matthew of Paris was not exaggerating, because we've archaeologically found the remains of these peasants who came to London, starving to death, and there was no food. They were dug up here in an archaeological site. There are pits after pits after pits. When they first found these individuals, they thought they were plague victims from the early 14th century, but no, these are from 1258 to 1259. These are people who came to London to find something to eat and starved to death. And Harris describes these quite clearly in his notes, and then he dies in 1259. And we don't know whether he's a victim of this famine as well. There was a religious movement in Italy at this time where the weather was awful, where we get the flagellants. These are people who are parading in the streets and singing songs and flailing themselves because they want to be the first in line to be raptured to heaven because they think the weather is so bad it must be the second coming. In Japan, we get the Shoga famine. Same kind of thing. Rural peasants flock to the coast. There's nothing to eat. They're starving to death. There's cannibalism. It's awful. All around the world. In these years, following the Samos eruption, we get famine in India, in Ethiopia, and yet, somehow my southwestern archaeological colleagues have somehow ignored this event. Prior to Samos, most of the archaeological sites north of the San Juan, up on Mesa Verde, people lived in these unit pueblos, little single-family sort of settings. Shortly afterwards, they gathered into much larger kinds of sites, into collective groups, in places like Goodman Point and Yellow Jacket and Sand Canyon, where we've recently excavated. And these are places where there was then sudden abandonment, where there was conflict, there was evidence of warfare at some of these sites, Sand Canyon, Castle Rock. So most people think that, like, people in this part of the world lived in this kind of site most of the time, and that's not true. This is where people went at the very end of the climate crisis that occurred after Samos. And even these places were not livable for very long. When they leave, we should be able to attract these people by the fancy black and white pottery they make, except most of the pottery people make looks like this. And this stuff looks the same everywhere. And so it's really hard to follow these people after they leave. But most of them go south, and we've known this for a while. They don't go south just from Mesa Verde, but also from the Kayenta area in northeastern Arizona. They all go south. A few years ago, Steve Lexon at Colorado thought that, he had this idea that the last lords of Chaco, who ended up in Aztec, went south too, went from Chaco up to Salmon, up to Aztec, and then down to this place called Casas Grandes, Pacame in Mexico, and Chihuahua. And not everybody agrees with this. Lots of people don't. But there is a story in the Zuni oral tradition about a time in their history when they were required to split up. It was an unhappy story. They were not happy with this prospect. They had to do something because wasn't possible for all of them to live together anymore. They did this thing that's described by Frank Cushing as the choice of eggs. Where two different groups, one chose the eggs of the raven and one chose the macaw eggs. So we know this had to occur at a time when macaws were present, so it's sometime after 800 AD. They did this by playing hand games, where people would hold those eggs, like rather than a tally or a token, hold those eggs in their hands. They played a hand game until one side won and one side lost. The people that chose the macaw egg, the parrot's eggs, are the ones who left and went south. They were never seen again. The raven eggs were chosen by the people who stayed behind, the people who became the Zuni. So at Pacame, which is this giant site in Chihuahua, there are macaw breeding pens after 1250 AD. After the Samos eruption, after this big migration south, they're breeding macaws there. Somebody brought them from somewhere. I don't know if this was the ancestors of Zuni, the winter people, or not, but it's interesting. The other part of that story, the Zuni say that when those people left, they went to the land of everlasting sunshine. There is only one place in all of the Southwest, after AD 800 and before AD 1275, that was never eclipsed. So that's the land of everlasting sunshine to me. It makes a great story. I don't know whether it's true or not. I have no idea whether it's true or not, but I think that's possible. Some of my colleagues will scream when they hear this. And that's Edvard Munch's Scream. It was the most valuable painting in the world, I think, when it sold. That's a Krakatoa sunset behind him. That's the sky after Krakatoa. That vivid sunset. So I think some people are going to hate this idea. Environmental determinism is something we were just taught to like run away from as anthropologists. But there's a story, and so I felt compelled to tell it, so I'm here and I came and I told it and I'm done. Thank you.